What if your teacher accused you of cheating, but it turned out you were a genius all along? Jamal was a quiet kid, someone who never stood out in class, never raised his hand unless asked. He kept his head down, did his work, and hoped to get through the day unnoticed. But when he scored the highest mark on the final exam, everything changed. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And while you're here, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a story that's as real as it is surprising. Mrs. Anderson was one of those teachers who could spot trouble from a mile away. With years of experience, she trusted her instincts. She was sharp, observant, and she rarely got it wrong. So when Jamal turned in an exam that didn't just score high, but was flawless, her first thought wasn't admiration. He must have cheated, she told herself. Jamal was one of those students you might not even notice at first. Quiet. Reserved. The type to sit at the edge of the classroom, blending into the background. He wasn't known for raising his hand or standing out in any way. In fact, until that moment, Mrs. Anderson had barely said more than a few words to him all year. But this exam? It wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. Every answer was correct, every calculation perfect, every word on the essay section written with precision. To Mrs. Anderson, it didn't add up. Jamal had never been the top performer. How could a student like him suddenly produce work at a level beyond even the honors students? Her mind raced with explanations, but she landed on one conclusion: this couldn't have been his work. What Mrs. Anderson didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jamal's brilliance had been there all along. Hidden. Untapped. Misunderstood. The classroom fell silent. Mrs. Anderson stood at the front, her arms crossed, the test paper in her hand like evidence in a trial. Her voice, usually calm and steady, was sharp now. "I know you cheated on this test," she said firmly. "There's no way you did this on your own." All eyes turned to Jamal. He was standing by his desk, his posture tense. For a moment, it looked like he might say something. But the words didn't come. Instead, he just stood there, caught in a storm of emotions he couldn't fully process: confusion, embarrassment, and something deeper. The class began murmuring, their whispers swirling around him. A few snickered under their breath. Others just stared, waiting to see what he'd do. Jamal kept his head down, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as though it was the only thing holding him up. Mrs. Anderson, seeing no reaction, continued. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jamal looked up then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. But he still didn't speak. What could he say? That he'd spent hours preparing for that test? That the answers came naturally to him because they always had, even if no one noticed? Would she believe him? Would anyone? The silence was heavy. And for Mrs. Anderson, it felt like confirmation. She nodded to herself, more convinced than ever that her instincts had been right. "I'll be speaking to the principal about this," she said before dismissing the class. The walk home that day felt longer than usual. Jamal replayed the moment in his head, over and over. Every word. Every glance. The way the other students looked at him, not with admiration, but with doubt. At home, his mother noticed something was off. "What happened at school?" she asked gently. But Jamal shrugged it off, mumbling something about a tough day. How could he explain it? How do you tell someone that your best effort had been dismissed as dishonesty? The following days at school were no easier. Whispers followed him down the hallway. A few students asked him outright, "Did you really cheat?" Some said it as a joke, others were serious. Either way, it stung. And yet, through it all, Jamal remained quiet. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to prove something that should have been obvious, that the work was his, every single word of it. What would you do in Jamal's shoes? Would you try to explain yourself, knowing people might still not believe you? Or would you wait for the truth to reveal itself, even if it meant enduring the pain of being misunderstood? This moment in Jamal's life wasn't just about the accusation, it was about how quickly people are willing to judge, how assumptions can overshadow the truth. And the real question is, how many times have we all been in Jamal's position, or perhaps, in Mrs. Anderson's? The days that followed were heavy for Jamal. Each step into the classroom felt like walking into a room where every pair of eyes carried the weight of judgment. Yet, amidst the unease, there was someone who had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. Baron Trump, a student known for his quiet confidence and sharp observation, had been watching the entire situation unfold. He had noticed Jamal long before that test. The way Jamal sat in class, not saying much but always listening. The way his notebooks were filled, not with idle doodles, but detailed notes and ideas that no one else seemed to notice. Baron knew there was more to the story than Mrs. Anderson's accusation. One morning, As the class settled into their seats, Barron did something no one expected. He stood up, calm and deliberate, and walked to the front of the room. Facing Mrs. Anderson, he spoke with a quiet conviction that immediately drew everyone's attention. "I don't think Jamal cheated," Barron said plainly. His words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them cutting through the tension. "I think you're missing something important." Mrs. Anderson, taken aback, looked at Barron with a mix of surprise and skepticism. "And what exactly am I missing?" she asked, her tone firm but not dismissive. Barron glanced at Jamal, who sat frozen in his seat, unsure of what was happening. Then he turned back to the teacher. "He's not like the rest of us," Barron said. "He doesn't need to cheat because he's thinking on a level we don't. You just haven't seen it yet." The room was silent. The students who had been so quick to judge Jamal were now watching Barron with wide eyes, trying to make sense of his bold declaration. Mrs. Anderson hesitated. She wasn't used to being challenged by her students, especially not like this. But Barron's words had struck a chord. There was no defiance in his tone, only sincerity. "And how can you be so sure?" she asked, folding her arms. "Because I've seen it," Barron replied. "The way he solves problems, the things he writes in his notebook. He's not just answering questions, he's seeing things the rest of us can't. If you really want to know the truth, give him another chance. A test where you can see him work, start to finish." The suggestion lingered in the room, sparking murmurs among the students. Jamal, still seated, felt his chest tighten. Was this his chance to prove himself? Or would it only deepen the doubts? "Now, let me ask you this, if you were in Jamal's position, would you take Barron's suggestion? Or would you worry that even another test wouldn't be enough to erase the accusations? And what about Barron, do you think you'd have the courage to stand up for someone like that, especially when no one else believed them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have acted differently?" Barron's words set something in motion that no one could stop. Mrs. Anderson, still skeptical but now curious, decided to take Barron's suggestion. She arranged for Jamal to sit a new test, one that would be supervised and monitored from start to finish. But this wasn't just about proving whether Jamal had cheated. It was about uncovering what had been overlooked all along. The day of the test arrived, and Jamal sat quietly at his desk. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the clock on the wall. As the test began, Mrs. Anderson watched closely, her sharp eyes following every movement. But as time passed, something began to shift in her expression. Jamal wasn't hesitating. His pencil moved swiftly, his focus unwavering. He wasn't just answering questions, he was solving them with an efficiency and precision that seemed almost instinctive. When he finished well before the time was up, Mrs. Anderson couldn't hide her surprise. After collecting the test, she decided to dig deeper. That evening, she reviewed Jamal's work and compared it to his notes from class. But it wasn't just the answers that stood out, it was the patterns in his thinking. Jamal's notes weren't typical for a student his age. They were filled with advanced problem-solving techniques, ideas far beyond the curriculum, and something even more extraordinary, a detailed sketch of a computer program he'd been quietly working on. Curious, Mrs. Anderson brought the program to a colleague in the tech department the next day. "Take a look at this," she said, handing over the pages. What came next changed everything. The program Jamal had designed wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. It could solve complex mathematical problems, process data, and provide explanations in a way that rivaled the work of graduate students. The colleague stared at the papers in disbelief before finally saying, This is incredible. Where did you get this?" Mrs. Anderson's mind raced. How could she have missed this? All this time, she had been so focused on what Jamal didn't say, what he didn't do, that she failed to see what he was capable of. The next day, Mrs. Anderson asked Jamal to stay after class. As the other students filed out, she sat down across from him, the program in her hands. "Jamal," she began, her voice softer than he had ever heard it, "did you really create this?" Jamal hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. Jamal looked down at his hands. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. No one ever asked. And there it was, the heartbreaking truth. Jamal wasn't hiding his talent. He simply didn't think anyone cared enough to notice. How often do we overlook the potential in those around us, simply because they don't fit our expectations? How many Jamals have we missed, dismissed as unremarkable when, in fact, they were extraordinary? What do you think Mrs. Anderson should do now? How would you handle it if you realized you had misjudged someone so completely? Mrs. Anderson sat at her desk long after the school day had ended, staring at Jamal's program. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't expected. How had she missed this? How had she misjudged him so badly? She thought back to every glance, Every quiet moment when Jamal sat in her classroom. His silence wasn't indifference, it was focus. His reserved nature wasn't disengagement, it was thoughtfulness. And all this time, she had let her assumptions blind her to what was right in front of her. The weight of her mistake grew heavier the more she thought about it. Her voice had carried authority, and with it, her accusations had carried power. By labeling him a cheater, she had put Jamal through unnecessary humiliation. And for what? A moment of misplaced certainty. Mrs. Anderson's chest tightened as she thought about the pain her words must have caused. Jamal wasn't a problem to be solved, he was a mind that needed to be nurtured. He wasn't a cheater, he was an innovator. And she had almost crushed his spirit because she hadn't taken the time to understand him. That night, Mrs. Anderson made a decision. She couldn't undo the past, but she could try to make it right. The next morning, Mrs. Anderson waited until the other students had left the room. As Jamal packed his books, she called him over to her desk. Her expression was different, softer, almost vulnerable. "Jamal," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "can we talk for a minute?" He nodded cautiously, stepping closer. "I owe you an apology," she said, her words measured but sincere. "I was wrong to accuse you. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I didn't take the time to see who you really are. I see it now. You're brilliant, Jamal. Truly brilliant. And I should have recognized that long before now." Jamal stood quietly, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but there was something in his eyes that softened. A mixture of surprise, relief, and maybe even a little forgiveness. "I hope," Mrs. Anderson continued, "you can forgive me. But more importantly, I hope you never let anyone make you feel like you're less than what you are." Jamal didn't respond with words. Instead, he nodded slightly, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that words couldn't capture. From that day forward, things changed. Mrs. Anderson became one of Jamal's biggest advocates, encouraging him to share his talents and even connecting him with mentors who could help him grow. The classroom no longer felt like a place of judgment for Jamal, it became a space where his potential was celebrated. So, what do you think? Do you believe Mrs. Anderson's apology was enough, or do you think it's harder to rebuild trust once it's been broken? Have you ever been in a situation where someone misjudged you, or where you misjudged someone else? How did you handle it? Let us know in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need a reminder to see the potential in others. Word spread quickly. What had started as a classroom misunderstanding turned into a revelation that rippled far beyond the school walls. Jamal's program, once overlooked, was now the center of attention. Teachers, administrators, and even local tech professionals couldn't believe the complexity of what he'd created. Mrs. Anderson, now one of Jamal's biggest advocates, wasn't content to simply apologize, she took action. She reached out to a nearby university known for fostering young talent. With her help, Jamal was invited to present his work at a youth innovation conference. The day of the event, Jamal stood in front of an audience for the first time, nervous but determined. As he explained his ideas, the crowd didn't just listen, they were captivated. For the first time, Jamal wasn't just a quiet student in the back of the room. He was the center of attention, and this time, it was for all the right reasons. And yet, Jamal wasn't the only one who had changed. Mrs. Anderson carried her own lesson forward. She became an advocate for recognizing hidden talents, reminding her colleagues and students alike that brilliance doesn't always come in loud, obvious packages. Jamal's journey reminds us of something powerful, that we should never underestimate someone based on how they present themselves. Quiet isn't a lack of capability, and reserved isn't a lack of intelligence. Often, the greatest potential lies in those we least expect. Take a moment to reflect. If you were in Mrs. Anderson's shoes, would you have been able to recognize Jamal's talents? Or have you ever been in Jamal's position, judged unfairly despite your best efforts? What would you have done differently? Have you ever stood up for someone when no one else would? Share your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective. If Jamal's story inspired you, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button to join us for more stories like this one. And before you go, take a moment to leave a comment, whether it's about a time you stood up for someone, or when you realized you misjudged someone's potential. Thank you for watching, for reflecting, and for being part of this community. Stay tuned, there's always more to learn, more to share, and more stories to inspire.